Okay. Hello again. This is another Miércoles de SOMA. Estamos en Salostock, México, en la escuela de verano de SOMA, para nuestra última charla de los miércoles que va a ser transmitida desde acá, pues con invitados que no están presentes con nosotros, pero que los estamos invitando a que hablen con el grupo de participantes de este año de SOMA Summer, bajo el título de Avatars in Paradise, que ha sido un curso dedicado a al estudio de las mitologías neoliberales y su efecto en los discursos identitarios, los discursos de liberación y las prácticas artísticas contemporáneas. Eso me dieron, ¿no? Sorry. That's, yes. No? Sorry, it seems like we're not live. Yes, sí, sí. Un momento, estamos acá con una dificultad técnica. Carolina is texting me right now saying that we're live. ¿Ya no llega nada o qué?
No. Pero bueno, ya pueden llegar sincronizar.
¿Pero sigo hablando?
Sí, la gente que está conectada.
Ok. Perdón por la interrupción. Entonces, hoy tenemos el honor de tener de invitada a Nora Khan, que es una crítica y escritora nacida en Rhode Island, pero ahora es directora de Project X Foundation para el arte y la crítica. Y Nora se ha especializado en un tema muy particular, que son la construcción de mundos virtuales, postdigitales, y cómo eso a su vez afecta a los temas que nos importan acá en el curso de SOMA Summer, que tiene que ver específicamente con la construcción de nuevos imaginarios identitarios, comunitarios y globales. Así que bienvenidos a este miércoles de SOMA con Nora Khan. And now I'm going to introduce Nora for our English-speaking audience and our students here at SOMA Summer. This is the SOMA program that is in English for international students to share time with us. Today, it's our last public talk online, but the program is being run here at Hacienda Santa María Salostock in Tlaxcala, Mexico. And we have a great group of participants that are here joining us from different universities, already art professionals and independent professionals that are coming here from many different parts of the world. So we want to welcome Nora Khan. And Nora has been a person that has been very influential for me and another whole generation of artists that are interested in the ideas of new spaces and new virtual digital spaces and new representations of space and new construction of space that specifically relate to the topics of this year's program that is called Avatars in Paradise, in which we're examining how neoliberalism expresses itself into new forms and how those forms are co-opted or co-opt us. And last week we had a very great guest, Ana Maria Millán from Colombia, that has worked specifically with virtual aesthetics and post-digital aesthetics in order to break down the kind of like the dogmatic way of looking at representation and what avatars and animations can give us that classical representation or the liberal ideal of representation cannot. Like what happens with invisibility, what happens with opacity, and how do you use those to create new identities that not necessarily are being represented. But today, Nora is giving us here a really special time to share with her, learn about her work, and connect with these ideas that are very pressing for us here at SOMA Summer in Avatars of Paradise. But I think Nora has explored them way, very deeply, and for many, many years, it's her area of expertise. So we're super, super lucky and honored to have Nora Khan here from Los Angeles. So thank you so much, Nora, for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Juan. It's so lovely to be here, and thank you for having me. I really wish I could be there with all of you in person. That would have been nice. I was in Mexico exactly this time last year, so it's a little bit bittersweet, but I am comfortable with virtual and digital connections, so I think I will survive. So let me just share my screen here, and maybe you could let me know that everything is fine visually on this side. Okay, good.
Yes.
Great. So this is just a short group of hopefully productive and generative notes on vicariance and belief. And I think I'll just start with what I have gotten a sense from Juan and from others who have been in the school that I've DM'd a bit with on Instagram, who have let me know about the kind of course of the conversations that you've been having this week. Thinking about avatars, thinking about radical new models for technology and for culture, and for modes of speculative flexibility. So I'm currently, just to give you a little sense of where I'm at, I'm in the middle of work on a book that was supposed to be just about criticism of technology, but as these things happen, became memoir, became diary, became, deep gazes into the mirror, the abyss that kind of came up a lot in the last 2 years. And as always, I'm trying to explore our evolving emotional and psychological relationships to technology. So even though I've spent a lot of time, many years, as Juan wrote, I still feel like I'm often circling back to the beginning, no matter how much ink has been spilled. Thinking about, machines, primarily machines that are looking at us, thinking about the emotional relationship that we have to machines as they change us, and what we do with this continual sense of being watched, and how we think of ways to acknowledge that seeing, and the machine's gaze, the God's eye view, which in my mind is basically this kind of eye, or this eye, which is around all the time, hovering in the air when you feel and know is there, even if it doesn't come in this form, but you have a kind of substrate or sense in your day-to-day. So how we can embed this knowledge of being seen and captured into a language of strategy is, where I've been, putting a lot of my time and thought in the last few years, particularly when we're so profoundly shaped by the efficiency of this seeing of us, of this determining of us, named through the connectionist politics of computational culture. And I think, I've returned to the same question of whether we can imagine a machinic eye that imagines, each individual unmoored and roving and seeing in every direction, flexible and changing. And what kind of simulation of society would that kind of eye produce? What kind of mental models do the machines that we engage with, how do they influence our beliefs and our own mental models to be fixed or rigid or authoritarian as we experience them now? So our relationship, or the relationship between us and technology, means a relationship always and an exchange between ideologies, whether it's the machine model in contrast or in synchronicity with our own models, computational and predictive models that produce our world, produce a world that is, dystopian beyond even worse scenes in Minority Report. I'm speaking from a context that is highly policed. I'm in Los Angeles, where predictive policing, first took root and flourished. It is crucial in a setting like this to understand how algorithmic policy and modeling shapes the map of the mental model of the coded gaze, the zones and areas that mental model creates, split between safety and high risk, individuals of high crime and possible social blight, individuals of low risk. So it's not only a real map that we walk through every day in Los Angeles, but a map that is based entirely on prediction and then possibility. That's radically changed our conception of proof and justice and evidence. So this is, just a general heat map and a screenshot from a Predpol kind of scanner, which Jackie Wang writes about in Carceral Capitalism, which is an amazing book, where she describes the red zone or the red square zone of Predpol, these temporary crime zones where police use methods that are inscrutable to citizens who do not have access to law enforcement knowledge and infrastructure. Predpol, in a way, remakes and rearranges the space through which we move each day, relying on dirty data collected by the police that creates a feedback loop that ossifies racialized police practices. And in this process and in this logic, more data is always better. As more data increases accuracy and efficiency as the story goes, and justifies more surveillance and expansion of policing and carceral operations that generate even more data. And so, maybe others, we should see the audience, but maybe others felt, caught in a number of loops, a number of computational loops over the past couple of years, especially as we're communicating in these virtual forms. But for me, I think it's the loops of computational logic that I've been paying attention to most, especially when I spend a lot of my time in the field of AI ethics and the improvement of systems that often justifies the expansion of the logic that is being critiqued. A few years ago, when I was focusing on Predpol, I was living in Detroit and wrote just a very small book called Seeing, Naming, Knowing, that was really about the creep of surveillance, the tiny, tiny movements and iterative changes that are so imperceptible to the eye that you have to kind of realign your vision to notice it, enacted by institutions and authorities in real time. And the start of that book was about Project Greenlight, which are these green light cameras that you see on the screen here, which create their own kind of zones of risk. They read license plates, they store facial data, and they invade and impinge the day-to-day in tiny, tiny steps. I remember living in Detroit, a time when I didn't see the green lights. And back in around 2017, after Los Angeles had instantiated Predpol and had taken full, had become very effective, New York, Detroit, Atlanta, Miami, lots of cities in the US and their respective police departments start to think about what are other methods of surveillance and policing that can be slowly spread through like the civic and business sphere. So cameras sitting in the foyer of banks, watching your expression as you look at your bank account, machines that read your face to gauge affect and emotion without the need of a person around. And the creep has been slow but steady and sure, of course, over the last 10 years. With Project Greenlight, what was interesting is like there wasn't a very good sense, and this is where a lot of the debate took place, of what was on the other end. For 2,400 cameras, were there 2,400 people who were monitoring it day and night? And there was clear that there wasn't enough manpower on the side of the police to actually conduct the work of constant surveillance, meaning to interpret and gather. Instead, at random or based on certain Predpol algorithms, pieces of footage from certain hours of the day and certain parts of the map would start to be integrated with the surveillance happening through Project Greenlight. But it was a slow process taking course over 5 to 6 years. In the lieu of that process, just the presence of the green light, just the presence and the threat of something that could be watching on the other side became even more compelling. And so for me, then the psychology of surveillance was just as much a part of the story of surveillance spreading through the US as the reality of it. So the story that was being told. Over COVID, I was focused more on the ways that we are seduced into capture, the really literal work of thinking about surveillance involves looking at like white papers that predict criminality based on facial phrenology, or looking at algorithms and machine bias through these epic pieces by organizations like ProPublica, which in 2016 broke the story. But during COVID, I was really thinking more about how we were speaking to each other online, how we think and consume fake or real algorithmically produced or human written news within our bubbles, and how we come to think of each other within our respective bubbles, especially as technological mediation becomes our norm. And so the pandemic, of course, activated and formalized experiences that were already very much in place, from surveillance to tracking to harassment, and the effects, the long-term psychological effects of thinking and being mediated online. So the early images of COVID models seem very funny in retrospect, because in 2 years we've obviously updated our information, not to remain the same, but to adapt our models. But during COVID, what I found was it was the work of negotiation between my mental model and my political model and my ideological model, which was sometimes conversant, often happily synchronous with friends, but of course often in conflict with others who share different mental models of the world. And we saw this with COVID, the kind of fury that continues to unfold over changing models of governance and changing models of public address about what is the right model to follow and what is the right amount of distance and mask and unmask. And so I was noticing during this time, I was still teaching at RISD and Digital Plus Media, that my students who, like me, were started as gamers or started in games in some form and ended up in the arts or in arts criticism and critical writing, I found that a lot of folks who worked with world building and games and simulation had an easier time, let me put it that way, negotiating between theories and changing theories and changing public knowledge, in part because they built simulations all the time. They worked with expectations of new events based on context and past understanding, and they knew that scientific predictions are subject to chance and subject to constant change and collaborative negotiation. So over the last 2 years, if we weren't aware of it before, we're now acutely, constantly being trained into thinking about the baseline models of people, whether as bouncing dots and cubes and squiggles and simulations, but also as ghosts in the architecture around us, implied presets of bodies that move through space. I would say I think about images like this quite often, baseline models that affect and shape and generate how we think about people in engineered or simulated space. These simulated spaces also produce reality and shape the stories we tell about each other in the world. You can imagine it as a body without history and a body without politics, all with essentially the same ability. Just minimize this a bit, and the same, living in a void without a kind of past or future and without much complication, a neat body that can move through engineered space. This body exists on an equal plane with others, with all other bodies, all with essentially the same ability, or if deficient, the ability through sheer will to conquer their lacks to become a real and full model. In this world, you can have different enough looking models, a whole palette of representation. So visually, yes, you'll see different ages, different ethnicities, different genders and orientations, different weights and heights and levels of ability, which still manifest in mechanics that are fluid and slotted into the game's mechanics. But they move through the world in exactly the same way, with essentially the same levels of ability and without much friction. Represented are all political stripes, from communalist to vegan to gun-toting fascist, ready, casual people, as in the previous slide. The models move through the world with the same levels of ability, moved about and made to function according to the maker's whims. They start also on the same XYZ gridded plane. A woman from another ethnicity of maybe more or less privilege, which is hidden and not factored into the model. We see the ways that histories of health and opportunity that are carried epigenetically, encoded in our flesh and DNA, might be disappeared in this model, in which we're all more or less on the same plane, ready to go out into the world. And if we want to, with the right amount of ambition and talent and desire, happy and with good attitudes, able to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps if we just want a good life enough. The plane of opportunity extends around as far as the eye can see, asking to be filled up with action and movement and activated in the right environment. And in this space, we leave no traces behind. The beautiful thing for me about thinking about maps and simulations and understanding them as constantly coded is to think about the fixed terms that cartography creates, the culture that creates the map, the culture that creates the model, and the values that create the cartography we take as fact or objective truth, or if we're tired enough or critical enough, able to look at the ways that these things parse and create our reality. When I look at old civilization maps, I think of the ways that the culture that created the map come through in the naming of land. And this is a very clear and fun example. Civilization often had like frontier land and claimed land, and the game's values of mobilization would come through that naming. It's a very straightforward game about organizing human behavior towards conquest and production and constructing industrial civilization. You could understand crisis as unfolding always right beyond civilization's gate, at the edge of the frontier, the quote unquote barbarians at the gate as a trope. To take these maps and change the names means to think about what elements of the map are sovereign, what elements are always deigned as to be dissolved, what land panels are gridded and meant to be used and filled up, and where are air and water and land considered always and ever resources to be extracted. And to possibly change some of the naming on the map means to make it something else. It means to undo the construction and ease with which we can create new maps. Maybe beyond the frontier is a community in process of restoring a matrilineal line, or a nomadic commune that actually is redistributing resources instead of a city to be raised, empty infrastructure, and so on. So simulations and maps and cartographies are incredibly potent as ideological tools, as themselves hiding ideologies and manifestations of ideology. And I'm seized over and over again in thinking about that act of continual renaming, especially when the map and its language and its naming are often hard to see or disappear because it is an ideological exercise to create a map. These maps create models of the world that we enact over and over and over again. For example, one of the ideologies you could think of with 3D modeling is the idea of a person as a blank slate, as an endlessly reinventable entity, despite genetics, despite history, despite political and economic forces. In philosophy, the blank slate is a widely debated and debunked theoretical concept, and yet it still holds incredible power. The idea of difference as difficulty, the tabula rasa as a kind of starting point. In The Blank Slate, which is a book by Steven Pinker, Pinker explores the idea of human nature and its moral, emotional, and political colorings that are carried with you no matter what you would like. He shows how a lot of intellectuals have denied, and over time, the existence of human nature by embracing these linked dogmas. The blank slate, where the mind has no innate traits, and the body no innate traits that have been carried on through history. The noble savage, the idea that people are born good and corrupted by society. And then, of course, my favorite, the ghost in the machine, that idea that each of us has a soul that makes choices free from biology. So each of these ideologies carries a moral burden. And so defenders whose worldview, whose power, and whose position is based on that ideology, of course, engage in all sorts of tactics to mark or discredit or reinvent worlds based on that ideology. So of course, our world is and our relations with others are this constant negotiation of ideological positions, which is super interesting in simulation or math, as you can see it so clearly named and so clearly laid out. And then you start to see it everywhere all the time. So what would models and simulations that manifest their hidden assumptions begin to look like? What would it mean to think about the group of scientists who create all of the COVID models that might have managed your movement through public space, through sprays of antiseptic and antibacterial liquid that you would walk through, to see the negotiation and process of creating a model that is actually culturally rooted, a model that's actually based on assumptions of time and capacity and when people work and where they work and what times of day. Here's where I often turn to the cognitive notion of vicariance, which is a concept of Alan Bertaux's in the book, The Vicarious Brain, Creators of Worlds. And this book's been very important to me because it describes the way that the human brain models and simulates and builds worlds and creates other futures all the time. And in fact, our ability to simulate alternate futures and other mental models other than the ones that we hold is key to our own evolution. In thinking about technology, I've been most interested in looking for a constant practice of active revision of my own mental models of the world, to think about the ways my tastes and preferences, my ethics, traumas, and other experiences can be built on, but also continually revised. So right now we're practicing an active projection where I'm imagining the audience is somewhere out there and real, and you imagine me as a real person. This is also a form of simulation. To stay connected in this conversation and in this space, we have to do a lot of empathy work, which means we have to believe in the simulation that we're in. Everyone in this room is. It's an enormous amount of mental work. Writing itself, too, is an act of vicariance, creating a world between two people, inviting others into this kind of virtual house, taking them through all of the rooms of the house, and then saying goodbye. Interpersonally, and the kind of sustained isolation that we've been working through, to take care to balance our mental models with others, to take and discard information when models no longer work, has been crucial. I'm struck by the scholar Ruha Benjamin, who was writing quite a bit about mental models over the last few years. And she writes, "The tension between innovation and equity is what keeps me up at night. How do we develop approaches to health and well-being that don't simply substitute technological fixes for wider social change? Fixes that do more to widen the gross inequities that already stratify life chances? How do we advance life sciences without reinforcing popular conceptions of race as biological, gender as destiny, or disability as tragic? After all, as we push the boundaries of the human with science and technology, we're also reinforcing and sometimes redrawing social fault lines in often unexpected ways." Bertaux here has the key point that vicariance and being able to mentally simulate is much more than duplication. Vicariance is an inventor. He argues that understanding our ability to make competing mental models from person to person actually helps us get rid of the idea of a universal or average human being. Competing mental models also trouble centralized power and disrupt the statistician's tendencies towards essentialism, one way of doing or one day of predicting. Given that everything we do is virtual in nature, there's a potential for continual disruption of the built world reviews in which we have models of types of people to act according to certain set rules. I know there's been some debate at SOMA about identity politics and neoliberalism, and the ways these systems can often freeze one as an other, whereas one being forever othered, continually making legible the qualities of one's otherness, which is a more intense setting than the US where this takes place. But I think for me, one of the reasons I was attracted to writing about technology was to find a different way to write about the self that wasn't about reiterating the quantities of one's otherness or the ways that one needs to be legible or begs to be legible. How do more precise representational models freeze us in a preset that we did not design? You know, if I had to give my computational representational model, find a different way to say that, I'm femme, I'm a woman, I'm cis, I'm first generation, I'm from Bangladesh. But I'm also, I can be opaque, I can be a mite of dust, and I could be, you know, a million different avatars. That was how I got into gaming when I was younger. And there was a kind of emancipation that was involved with that. So flipping back and forth between opacity and legibility, using strategies of opacity and what Glissant called the right to opacity, to be opaque, is, you know, a profound, you know, strategy that folks in, you know, digital art and in the digital space have found over time, and increasingly close neoliberal enclosure, for lack of a better word. And Berthoz wrote this book about cognitive variance in response to critiques across fields, politics, science, cultural studies, and the neglect of individual experience. Whether that's the experience of women across industrial design or POC in industry, or the complexity and context that defies computational representation, Berthoz's essential argument asks us to think about how do we get past dominant models of that empty 3D neutral paradigm that we start with? How do you represent the change and complexity that difference is without resorting to a computational politics of classing and sorting and classification? And how do we practice movement from the model we have to others? So if we take up the brain as an emulator of reality and vicariance as a natural process that we enact to create competing scenarios and possibilities to become more either evolutionarily fit or more cognitively fit for the chaos around us, we might understand simulation as a virtual activity and many of the mental activities that we do as a kind of simulation, which means we can model nearly everything we need here and now without the complex computational tools that are used in simulation. Can we possibly summarize the worldview of tech systems themselves, of AI algorithmic systems, as types of mental models that can be evolved and changed? I would argue, yes. Computer Simulation, Rhetoric, and the Scientific Imagination, this little book in the bottom left by Amy Roundtree, is probably one of the most important books that has really shaped my life. It looks like a very dry book. It is actually a fascinating book about the ways that simulations in different situations like Hurricane Katrina have shaped the movement of people and resources and activity in the world. So for example, during Hurricane Katrina, there were tons and tons of simulations done about how the water would rise over the levees and flood the city. And disaster response and civic response were totally based on these three simulations that had a pretty accurate description of how water did rise over the levees and broke them and moved into the city, which neighborhoods would be flooded, at what time, when people would need to evacuate. However, the simulations had no people in them. And so it was impossible for people watching them to imagine the flow of people, how people would actually like move in relation to the water. And so the disaster response was totally bungled. There was a political choice that was made to not put people in the simulations because it was going to be terrifying. And so the combination of scientific construction of a simulation plus kind of civic and political hand that came in is that there is actually a responsibility to like mediate data and mediate knowledge and drip it in a way that doesn't cause panic, created this ultimately more disastrous situation. So Roundtree's entire book is about the aesthetics of the simulation, how they embed relationships between theories, expectations about something new, and past understanding phenomena. And the language that is embedded within them, the kind of logic trees, really chronicles these relationships. Simulation code means, this quote at the bottom, means or points to relationships between theories, i.e. what we think is happening now, but won't know for sure until other evidence surfaces and forever validates the simulation. So an artist that I have looked at for a long time is Ian Cheng, whose Emissaries trilogy, some folks might be, I'm sure folks are already familiar with, and Emissary Sunsets the Self has been very formative for me. In each stage of Ian Cheng's pieces, animated characters that are in these video games that play themselves build their own fictitious world with the aid of a network of AI algorithms. The on-screen actions of the characters may seem unpredictable, but they are not random. It was a dizzying image to look at, so I'm going to move on from that. Each of the artificial lives in Ian's simulations, these artworks that have been developed over the last 6 years, grow from highly patterned, learned outputs of the same tools that categorize images and translate texts and recommend Amazon products. The result is this epic creation myth in which an artificial mind evolves over 3 generations in an attempt to arrive at sentience. Something that Ian has done over time is to give a sense of the scripts that he's given each of the beings in his life worlds, his little terrariums, where we can see these lives evolving. And for years, curators at museums would be furious with Ian because they could come into a piece and see, and I'll show a video of this in a moment, and see the life forms, clustered in a corner or sleeping or not moving. The cognitive states that are on display is part of Ian's grand epic of semi-intelligent agents in which AI brains, create their own decision architectures, and you can watch them evolve over time. Each of the agents observes, orients, and decides, and acts in a feedback loop with their environment, and create modes of orienting between fast reptile and slow limbic. Ian was very inspired by need-based AI from The Sims, but then started to think of what are the other mental models that propose that intelligence is distributed between the agent and the environment around in local affordances. How can we see evolution in real time? How can we see hunger and thirst, sociality and play, and in action in this kind of drama and play in an artwork? And how does it change our relationship to an artwork for it to live beyond us, whether we're looking at it or not, and for it to go on forever? So all of these aspects, a piece that goes on forever, a length of time that is nearly infinite, artwork that lives when you're not looking at it and you've left the room, changes our relationship, one, to thinking about artworks as artificially intelligent or machine intelligent, procedurally generated, where everything is variable, that is variable, and that we consider variable can be simulated, and moves the fixedness that very, very traditional art historical frames might have to bring to a piece of art, fixed, in a frame, fixed on a dais, fixed on the floor. Not even talking about media art here, but the methods of thinking about the human relation to an artwork that have defined so much of our understanding of contemporary art. And so I revisit Ian's works over and over again, in part because I love the works and enjoy the artist, but also because of the narrative building that takes on a life of its own. I saw a lot of these works for the first time 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 6. And I wonder what these figures are doing now and whether they are living as promised. So in part 1 of the series, Emissary and the Squad of Gods, we see, turn down the sound here. This is playing. So in Emissary and Squad of Gods, we see an ancient volcano, which nurtures a small community on the cusp of civilization. And we see the full story in wall text, and we see chaos on screen, explosions in the distance, strange voices blurting out commands, We see a shaman and a snake boy gathered around a totem known as a holy fumarole. Characters shift about. The girl's hit in the head by a piece of volcanic debris. Creatures and figures are animated by voices, ancient voices that bind the community. And the next episode, which comes before what you're seeing here, Emissary Forks at Perfection, the simulation's picked up many lifetimes later, and we're in a crater lake that's formed by the eruption. AI surveys the last vestiges of human life amid a landscape populated by Shiba Inu dogs. And here in this last section, Emissary Sunsets the Self, we find the crater lake has given way to Ascension Atoll. This is a final attempt of the AI to learn by droning, whereby it experiences the sensations and habits of a biological organism. I visited this piece a number of times on different days, and I was on one particular day of this running, and it looked something like a desert where an AI puddle was spinning into the side of a dune. Mike Pepe, who is a critic, writes critically about Ian's works, particularly pointing out the technocratic aims of such artworks and of such an artwork, and the narrative details being so essential for our understanding of the piece. He writes, the narrative details of any piece of Ian's work are not essential because the fantastic plot of the simulation is impossible to follow. Its sophistication exceeds the limits of human perception, is dizzying logically and aesthetically. Within the first few minutes, anyone will come to terms with the fundamental contradiction at play, that the character's stated goals are perfectly and purposefully interrupted by the machine's learning. Every moment of the work is a reminder of the fundamental incompatibility of human cognition with the machine's attempt to artificially replicate it. Emissaries, in short, is a large-scale conflict between the narrative character and the computer that diverts it. There's never any resolution. In fact, as you read this, the plot is still unfolding somewhere on the internet. To revisit Bertoz's idea of vicarious, the vicarious act is to create an imaginary world that emulates reality as in dreams. And it's this capacity that creates a vicarious mechanism where our brain can delegate to an internal double our role of the creator of worlds, creative scenarios that can anticipate the future. By focusing on potential challenges that could emerge in a simulated environment, we as evolving creatures and living organisms have this incredible capacity to vicariate and simulate a wide range of behaviors related to moving, navigating, wandering, and consuming, from the most instinctual to the most highly cognitive. I wonder in this world, what are the things that cannot be simulated? What are the uncapturable elements here which we can't see or discern? How does Ian bring us into the simulation to have a taste of what it might feel like to be algorithmically led, as though we don't feel that every minute these days? And how are we already living in legacy simulations of our own design, our habits, our cultures, our language, our laws, and of course our ideologies? The breaks in our simulation to tread dangerously in musk territories where we learn and become more powerful. And what I mean by more powerful here is cognitive flexibility. Though embodying this in this forking to new end states, we can override genetic hardwiring and neurological presets, destroying the map of our own personal world, even as we make it. Ian's work demands not only new seeing, but new languages. To be able to describe what is happening here coherently, we become a bit like the simulation, twisting and molding our descriptions to its movement. We have to labor to hear its not yet coined words and concepts, somewhere in the excruciating twist from normative to uncanny, from symmetrical to grotesque. When our own narratives break down, how do we deal with the void that rushes in? One is to leap right in and navigate the void and become more comfortable with the knowledge that there's no perfect end state. You just get better at managing yourself and your dread, at holding your story and inevitable contingencies side by side in your mind and in your body. Back in 2016, in a talk that gave on Ian's work, the questions that I had were about how the system betrays the system's making, its own spirit and intention, along and betrays the hand of the maker. One can see the lines of algorithms rising up, not literally, but in tracking their patterns and repetitions over time, the places that the rules start to bend, and the places that these forms start to create their own rules. When I first encountered these simulations and shots like these, I wasn't really sure of what I was looking at. This isn't unusual in digital art, where the pleasure of writing usually comes with an unknown experience or unfamiliar space and finding language to wrap around it. In these spaces, immediately are in an open world and camp filled with totemic and eerie figures surrounded by a primordial landscape, I'm seized by a whole range of unfamiliar sensations past the thrill of non-recognition. I think of the coded rule sets for characters and try to reverse engineer them in my mind, using the behavior here as sculptural material. A handful of basic algorithms drive these movements and are free to interact and behave as you will, making this experimental world a kind of virtual biome. The analogs of these genetic algorithms unfolding, whether an environment, character, an animal, or an object, gives us an intimacy with the computer carrying out the premise for each being, no matter how outlandish. Since I'm not actively taking part or playing a role within its bounds, it exerts an important pressure back on me to be a more active viewer. My natural impulse as a writer is to try to give a story and narrate this world in real time, but storytelling itself seems ill-fit and not particularly useful. Instead, I'm enthralled to the sensation of watching a civilization in the throes of birth, of early man coming to consciousness in a brutal and ecstatic process. Over time, the simulation becomes more challenging, more layered, and more complex, with early compositions showing detailed objects crashing and splitting across the field, and heads in some places that grow other heads and fold in on themselves. And even as the worlds start to cohere more, the controlled chaos flirts with glimpses of order. We're seeing evolutions of entire lifetimes and generations coming to pass within minutes. Perspective shifts on a dime and protagonists fade and merge. I'd like to suggest that spending time with fantastic avatars and fantastic objects trains one to see anew in a few ways. Watching this object, I'm jolted out of the standard God's eye view of simulation. I have to try and understand the being at its level and within its context. I'm trying to peer past the surface to guess at the rules that organize it beneath. And even as I feel the compulsion to interpret, to capture, to freeze, and to name, I'm refused at every step. And as a result, my relationality with the subject, my relationship to this object, and how it affects me becomes the subject itself. At first, all of this unscripted change that's impossible to narrate perfectly can seem monstrous and uncanny and strange. The human-aid figures are disoriented, they struggle to carry on, they perish before us. But we're able to see the interplay between the emergent and the algorithmic, the story, and us as a viewer, as a thrilling drama of what we experience in real life now in the 21st century. We're witnessing complexity that we can't hold, complexity we can't describe, a knowledge of a being or intelligence, or whatever name you might give it, something that is partially known, always on the periphery of consciousness. And we are aware of our developing an emotionally cohesive and coherent way to relate to this uncanny, partially known thing. And it turns out we're actually pretty good at creating meaning out of that. Critics of Chang describe the techno-determinism that's quiet and embedded within this world. Techno-determinism that overshadows the brilliance of the narrative itself. Pepe, for example, has described Chang's simulations as an argument for machine consciousness and for the second second capacity, sideline nature of human observation in relation to computation, in relation to AI, in relation to its risk models. I wonder if the answer is somewhere in between, a hybrid concept, move this back, where we are in tandem with machines and we are in relation to machines, and we're asked to make sense of our process of perspective and watching. If we see these beings not as entities, but as substances, as packs of organisms reactive to threats, expunging radical mutation, feeling and losing sensation of life, these are identifiable for us. And thinking about the mental models of each of these objects brings us back to our own. If we're thinking metaphorically about the underlying ideology of artificial lives, how can we work with and through the techno-utopian ideal of starting over, so deeply embedded into engineering? How do we make simulations that allow for difficulty and complexity in clashing personal and social histories? I think we can see a version of it here. Simulations ask us, who do we imagine living on into the future? And how are the worlds we're engineering today making life impossible for the models that are included or considered to begin with? How do we move from living on the edges of simulations and into the centers of the worlds that we move through? Machine learning engineers deploy vision systems that account for what they cannot model, and the fantasies and ideologies that embed them ask for new understandings of how we're treated and how we're understood within the human race. And here's where the machine I find, often shuts off to the effect of its own seeing. Though we may know all of the deeply flawed programmatic bias embedded imaging processes, as a culture, we're less and less comfortable with not being able to name what we can, not being able to name what we do see. As folks like James Bridle write, the automation bias is real, such that we value the information produced by the machine over ambiguous human observation. If our world affirms the vision and the model, then faith in the machine, its eye, and its logic overrides the other sense. It's step inherent in considering Ian's work to argue for the ambiguous human observation, the glitch and the smudge and the kind of description of these creatures in constant iteration and being, and argue for the ways that our language and understanding of modeling can be expanded and open and cracked open by being in conversation in relation to these things. Think of the actions that are tied to the metaphorical understanding that we have here, our ability to make sense of this metaphorical language, whether they're individual utterances or extended narratives, means that the values that we have that compromise a worldview come through the structured and engineered worlds that we make. Whether that's the dictums of neoliberalism, as you've been discussing, or different understandings of possibility and prediction, we can also always reverse engineer the values that were embedded in the model. And pieces like Ian's take us through that. So we might take up simulations that are not something distant or remote, but active tools we can grapple with and argue through. I'm going to put this over to the side here and share an exercise that I know folks have been doing a lot of different exercises in the school. Something I do with Ian's piece and did with a lot of students in the past, we play this and then we would talk about it together and ask whether it's possible to figure out the types of mental models that are embedded in these life forms without the artist narrative. So that would be one exercise we would do. Some of the most beautiful conversations we have is thinking about what position people felt in relation to these figures. Do they feel care? Do they feel a sense of a desire for mastery? Do they feel a desire for capture? And how does the process of observation change over the course of the 10 minutes of this video? So we watch it a few times in a loop and then track and write out how people felt in relation to the figures. It was fascinating to see. I've done it a number of times in different workshops. And people's desire for narrative and storytelling, framing, and understanding of the history and the why and the wheretofore of all of these beings would start to shift, even in the course of 10 minutes, to something more expansive, loose, and experimental and strange, where people were thinking about, the kind of like unseen limbs of these creatures as they came to be. They were coming up with stories that like moved with the movement and language that moved with the movement of the piece. We also question whether we were able to disrupt the God's eye view. Are we irrelevant to the action? How did that make us feel? Are we doomed to observe what's happening? How does the sense of time that you experience here, the knowledge that this goes on forever, change your experience of the piece? In general, practicing vicariance, whether it's through observation or through ekphrastic description or joyous description, allows us to work past the narratives that are so deeply embedded in engineering and computation, whether that's prediction, whether that's essentializing models, whether that's fantasies of continual restart. We can imagine endless simulations, games that go on forever, that allow for competing visions of social order, different iterations of dynamic relations between groups, and many different visions of power beyond the top down. We'll skip some slides. Just coming to close, one of the pieces that I keep coming back to is the system of language, and thinking about language itself as a mental model, as the force behind simulation. Language is actually what allows us to simulate our futures. And so when I see certain phrases that are repeated in, whether it's in culture or in headlines or just in the day-to-day neoliberal chatter that's around us, I can hear different mental models. Some of the phrases that actually like activated me to thinking about language as a mental model are up at the screen. I think it's number 2, people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. And we all believe red is another one. You're making it about that when it's really about class. Each of these produces its own kind of world, its own world and idea of what people should be able to do, people's relationship to their histories. Your relationship to people with different histories is all embedded within certain phrases. And so I started to think of each of these lines as ideologies that like unlocked or encoded an entire worldview and actually sets up a conversation with someone who you differ with, or gives you a sense of how they see the world. It gives a sense, a place to start with negotiation, especially with people you really, really vigorously disagree with. If folks have time, this would be an exercise that I find super productive and just want to share with you. And usually put the emissaries video on at the background and ask folks to draw up a mental image, maybe later, quite late there, maybe tomorrow, of the artificial life that represents you in a speculative simulation. So it might be this environment, or it might be a totally unknown environment. And in that process, try to think about the mental model of your avatar. How does your avatar see the world? How would you describe its mental model, the models, competing models within one mind many of us have? How does it move through the world? And how do you see it moving over time? How does it approach resources, and what other qualities does it have? In the second piece, you can either gather with another group or a partner and then talk about your artificial self's mental models. Do their theories of life and living coincide? Do they share goals? Do they have overlaps? Are they completely opposed and completely at odds? And then the second piece is to consider if they were living and moving in an open simulation together. What rules for living would emerge from their needing to get along? What frameworks would they need to be able to live far into the future? What relationship to power would they have? And between the two of you, or between your group, try to negotiate a rough set of rules for living together and commingling between the three of you. Some of the pieces to understand are to consider time, resources, personal history of this imagined avatar, its needs, its competing worldviews. And talking to each other, what I found is people often find in conversation what they never accounted for in their individual world. In the act of actually speaking to another person and figuring out this rough simulation of a world together, they were able to discern what they hadn't even considered. Researches over time, care, a version of insurance in this space, which often was rooted in their particular social and economic context. What would come to light and they're being thrown together, and how would the interactions of your artificial character change over time? And what did you find most difficult to account for? It's a really fun exercise if you just want to take part in it. And you can also come together all as a group to see how all of your avatars would interact. So just in this short few notes, we've taken up simulations as something that is not distant or remote, but an active tool that we can grapple with and argue through. As the oldest way that we think through time and the possibility of ourselves in relation to others, I can't think of a more fruitful possible tool for a moment. For modeling ourselves as a society in ways other than old tropes and worldviews, old binaries that brutalize and erase and stifle possibility, we might think of ourselves in relation to each other's emergent complexity on through time, through all the unsimulatable aspects of experience. I hope for simulation to become a common pedagogical tool for imagining more just worlds and orientations to environments, not just to survive, but also make space for more worlding. And I hope you all keep worlding well into the future. And thank you so much for listening. It's been a huge pleasure to join.
Thank you so much, Nora. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. And it really is a very, very specific part of what we've been talking the last few days, when we try to release us from a very kind of simulated condition that we're here, like we are in an old pulque hacienda that's now has changed its function into like an event, private event, a venue. And we've been here for 3 weeks, and you start thinking about simulations and simulative communities and simulative situations. And kind of like our challenge or worry, but I think it's a very propositive one, is how do we carry out everything that we've learned from each other from here, and not only on a virtual digital world, but in another type of like holistic virtuality. How do we really learn from each other and carry out what we've gotten from this place into the outside world, and how do we break that other like bigger simulation at the same time? So thank you. That was really great. I have some questions from the audience, from our participants here in Tlaxcala. So I'm gonna start with a question from David Nazca, who's joining us. He's here with us in Tlaxcala, coming from Chicago. And David asks, I'm reading from the texts that they're sending me. I am wondering what your thoughts on GANs, generally adversarial networks, are as it relates to machine learning. Do GANs have the potential to create machine intelligence and simulations that are even more problematic than human bias?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for that. I love what you just said about the simulation of the school or the workplace and the setting and how to export as models. I'd love to get back to that. Yeah, I just finished a book on art and images made through generative adversarial networks, which is rooted in a lot of my collaboration with Casey Rios, who wrote this book called Making Pictures with GANs. And I think we've seen a lot of interesting, compelling, I don't know if folks have been seeing the Mid-Journey AI images that are flooding Twitter and everywhere. But the kind of like evolution of GAN images over the last 6 to 7 years has been really compelling. especially the overlap with like the NFT space and algorithmic generation of endless images. If you can train GAN very simply, you have an endless flood of aesthetic images that are very difficult to interrupt because you're producing 1,000, 100,000 images at a time. Not at a time, but like in one run or in one cycle, depending on what kind of computer you have. So I guess to the question of whether aesthetic or simulation that's more problematic than the bias embedded already within machine intelligence produced through GANs, I think what you find is a concentration and amplification within GAN images that maybe always lead one back to the original, but you start to see even amalgams that are harder to see and name. So you're seeing like pieces and reflections and mirroring back to us of back to one of the original images that you trained the GAN on or trained the neural network on. And depending on whether it's unsupervised or supervised learning, these become more and more difficult to track and trace. So a big part of my book is taking a little bit of what I was speaking of, this active practice of tracking and seeing like an algorithm or seeing like a neural network, or trying to like simulate like what a machine sees when it sees a million images, is like the most profound challenge to art criticism and to our ways of seeing and understanding visual images. Is like, so as an art critic, when I work with an artist like Casey Reyes, who will send me their data set for what they use to train again, and it is a data set of 200,000 images. So I am trying to look at all of it, but what I'm ending up doing, because I'm flooded by it, I'm having to learn to practice pattern recognition, my own form of pattern recognition, to see certain styles, certain shapes, certain moods, certain atmospheres, and so my like language and method of evaluation changes. And so it's the sheer scale of it that creates this incredible challenge. I think there's the more that we train and see along with speed and scale, are trying to find an interpretive method that can work with such massive data sets to see the different GANs that are emerging. You can just go on OpenSea and find every kind of level of genetic algorithm on there. One that someone made and then someone is just reusing, and one that someone designed over like the course of many years. Like Mario Klingemann, for example, combines and chains algorithms together to produce these complex GANs. So I think with GAN aesthetic, you have to really look at the entire process, the data set that was used, how the images were selected, what images were fed, what images were left out through the process of training the GAN, and becomes a totally different way of evaluating. If you can evaluate a system or you could analyze a system, it really is about the entire collaborative process from beginning to end, the human choice plus the system coming up with its own decisions and aesthetics, and back in this loop together. It's not about one or the other, but looking at the entire process and evaluating the choices along the way. Hopefully that maybe gets to some kind of vague answer, but yes.
Thank you so much, Nora. Let's see, there's any more questions coming in. I don't know. It's just that we are in a very funny situation here. I'm the one who's broadcasting, but I'm away from the audience because where they are, the internet is not that good. So I have to be here waiting for
no worries. No worries.
Nora, I just had a question. If is there a possibility of you sharing those prompts for those exercises later to share with?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I had them actually in a Google Doc that I was going to share with everyone. I thought those were going to be on the screen, so I'll absolutely share it.
Awesome, fantastic. I think there'll be great exercises to do for the last 2 days that we have here.
Wonderful.
Well, it doesn't seem that there's any more questions. Nope. We've had a long day, but we really appreciate, and we again very honored to have been able to finish this 3-week program with you, Nora, and with specifically focusing on the subjects of this week. That's basically we were just exploring the idea of like, just to give you a little bit of kind of like a genesis of how we landed to your talk today, is that one of the things that we really discussed from Mohammad Salemi talking about the new Center for Research and Practice, is the idea of like exporting the model, or like passing the model around. The idea of like creating a new model for education, or a new model for politics, or a new model for programming. It's not necessarily, he said something like the model is a message. And yeah, it's very interesting. And then Ana Maria Millán talked a lot about how she's been involved in kind of like communist organizations and anarchist organizations in Colombia, and how for her, like the project of emancipation, or the project for liberation, it's something that, as many of her artworks, is not finished probably in a lifetime. It's just a series of tools that just are passed around. But I really enjoyed the fact that you also talked about language, because that's been a big thing for us here. You know, like we're just talking about our own spoken language. We're speaking English, but we have people from Europe, we have people from Colombia, from Argentina, from Mexico, and trying to find kind of like at the beginning, we tried to create a glossary, but getting us to definitions was also kind of like very, it wasn't like conducive to open the system, you know, like it kind of like put us back into like a very academic kind of like mind frame. But it was really great that we went there, because it totally kind of like pointed our deficiencies in trying to like specify language. You know, so like this last week we've been doing stuff like with sound, with experimental walking tours of the hacienda. We have been questioning ourselves, even our own use of English within our program.
Yes.
So this, like what you talk about language, is very, 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 very much where we are right now.
No, I really appreciate that. I think whenever a piece is translated, so like the experience of being translated into German is very different from being translated into Spanish or Thai or Bengali. One of the most enjoyable experiences I had was with the translator Diego Gerard, who's in Mexico City as part of Disonar. They translated a small book into Spanish of mine, this machine vision book. And it was amazing because that act of translation destabilizes all of the points that one thought one was making in English. It destabilizes everything, because every piece, every phrase had to be made, not had to be made, but like Diego's really striving to make it sensible and local to his context in Mexico City and his life living in Mexico and living in different towns and cities within the country. And so the context of surveillance in Detroit obviously is not the context of surveillance in Mexico City, but there are parallels because it is a model that has resonance. It's a model that is globally exported. But then once that model like kind of descends down to the ground, wherever it decides to land, it then takes on a new life. And so language is slippery and defies you. And even when you think that you've frozen it and you've frozen the meaning and you've really figured out what it is you're saying about AI or machine intelligence, because not only is the subject constantly changing, your language constantly has to evolve. And I find in the act of translation, I have to question any claim to a definition, which I think is part of the logic of not just the sciences, but any kind of system that tries to fix meaning. And that can be in the humanities as well. It's like any notion that meaning is fixed and the definition of these things is fixed, especially technology, which is impossible to perfectly define. And instead is about the psychological relationship that's constantly evolving. So I find language that changes and evolves and allows for that lack of definition or some vagueness where there should be precision is super important.
Yeah,
Yeah, completely agree.
Nora, if you grace us with one more question that just came in from Beck, who's also one of our participants here. Beck says, I'm curious if Nora could speak to other kinds of simulations that she sees as subjected to or organized by, aside from predictive policing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. Let's see. Yeah, so something I've been paying attention to a lot are, so just like a personal anecdote is like the way I grew up, my dad is a physicist. And so a big part of what he worked on were simulations of materials in space over time as they're affected by the gravity in space. And gravity in space is constantly expanding and contracting and changing. And so his work was always about thinking about like our movement on the speculative space station. If this was like the 80s and 90s, the space station was like still not quite yet built. And the construction of like spacesuits in space and whether they would like last or disintegrate over time. So much of his work was around thinking about the future of material in a possible future that had not existed yet. And so that was a big part of how I grew up. And so when I started to like play games or, you know, get involved in game design and writing about game designers, the simulation of the engineered space of the game was the one that I spent the most time in because it was active construction by a team of 100 or 150 people that was lived within. So there's so many types of simulation. There's computer simulations or simulations of political and health events. There's modeling like of traffic and like crowd control. Games are a different kind of simulation. But I think where I spend most of my time, at least to like find joy and like resonance, are space simulations, like the expansion of stars, the birth and death of stars, the movement of our Earth in relation to the sun. It's not like I put them on in the background and watch them, but like I do look at them quite a bit, in part because you can track over time how political attitudes in science are changing. You can see that in the aesthetic. For a long time, simulations of climate change, again, would not put people in different models. And you start to see them more now as the intensity of, and like the reality of climate change is, you know, it's really hot here. So it's like really coming to bear. And so the understanding that the visual models that are put out into the world actually have to be tied to strategy and tied to activity, I pay a ton of attention to. So I've been looking, I look at stars exploding and dying, and then climate models, especially in cities like Miami and Los Angeles and other coastal cities. I have like family and friends, in part because they help you think about the next 2 years or the next 5 years or the next 10 years in a way that is real and is not in the space of fiction. It's like computation at such a level that you can see what will happen pretty well to a pretty high degree of specificity and probability for the next 5 years or 10 years. You can model your life based on like how water levels are rising. Like 5 years ago, I was living in Miami for residency and just 3 months, and every afternoon the water was nearly waist level, and that was 5 years ago. And so architects and artists and everyone, just people living in Miami, were thinking very actively of, okay, I have 3 years based on this model, 5 years based on this model, and this is exactly where I need to move inland, and this is when I need to move maybe out of the south of Florida. So I'm a very practical person, so maybe I do use models to just know where I need to go and where what kind of strategy one needs for one's community and family and friends. Maybe it's a little bleak, but I actually see it as quite hopeful. Like I always see science and computation as hopeful once you get past the nasty stuff.
During your whole talk, I'm thinking, and I don't know if you're a fan, but Nathan Fielder from Nathan For You. I don't know if you've seen that show.
Yeah.
Has a new show on
Yeah.
HBO that is called The Rehearsal.
Yes. I saw that.
And like, he simulates and rehearses every possible variable in an interaction with a person.
Yes.
And models the architectural places where these encounters are supposed to take place, hires an actor, and then
Yes.
reenacts every possible interaction that is happen with this person. So well, I'm really looking for maybe watching it, and hopefully maybe we can watch it here.
Yeah, when I saw that, I was like, that is, someone made a show for me.
Yeah.
I mean, on another side, like on the fiction side, my start was in fiction. The fiction I write now is about sets and film sets and the process of like creating artificial atmospheres and simulating, people being born or people falling in love, and like how lighting and timing and the creation of like artificial set like actually intensifies your emotion and belief and understanding. I mean, that is what fiction is. So in addition to the rehearsal, adaptation has to be one of my favorite films, about making a film. Very meta.
Yeah. Well, Nora, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I really hope that you can collaborate with SOMA further.
I love that.
Maybe someday have you again here in Mexico. Would be fantastic.
I would love that.
Now, have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
We'll be in touch.
Yes, thank you. Good night. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for being here this Miércoles de SOMA. Bye.